Hi, Year 12s. Mr. Riley here. Hope you're doing well with your home learning. You should be getting this week a copy of a OneNote document from your geography teachers, which talks you through what your work is. So I thought I'd just talk you through it. I'm conscious that a few of you weren't here in lessons over the last couple of weeks, so I'm just going to give you a really speedy run through of what we did in those lessons, so that hopefully that'll help you out if you've got a few gaps. And then I'll talk you through what you need to do moving forwards. It's all written on the OneNote, but this will add a bit more depth and detail to it, and hopefully be a bit easier if I'm talking you through what's on screen at the same time. So I'm just going to open up a copy of the PowerPoint, which is available on OneNote, and also the PDF, a PDF version of the Birmingham handout that you've had with you. Apologies for my voice. I had wisdom teeth taken out yesterday, and they're still really sore, and I sound a bit stupid because I can't open my mouth properly. But I hope you can hear what I'm saying. Right, so Birmingham, let's go. We started off looking at what a player was, and effectively gave off this notion that a player was effectively a stakeholder in a decision-making process. And we linked up the players down here on the left in the multicolours with their definitions on the right. You can find the answers to that sorting on the PowerPoint. We then started thinking about what was going along. We started thinking about players in action along Long Road, and started thinking about the variety of players that might be involved in a decision-making exercise along the road, and came up with a series of players who would be involved if we were constructing a cycle lane down the road. We then came up with an activity to assess the relative power of each of these players. So we thought about what might influence how influential they were in the decision-making process. So things like the size of them, their budget, maybe how long they'd had a relationship with the place that they were living in, and you came up with the people that you thought were the most important in that decision-making process and the least important in the decision-making process. The next bit goes on to start talking about some of the important players that you need to know. So it talked about the EU, there's some gap fills. Those answers are on the PowerPoint. We then had a recap of structural and cyclical economic change. So that notion that structural economic change is effectively the change in the pie chart of employment, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary employment, and normally goes from changing from a fairly agricultural pre-industrial to a secondary heavy industrial phase, and then through into a tertiary dominated post-industrial phase. Structural economic change doesn't have to mean that things change that way, but the Fisher-Clarke model that has those 4 lines on suggests that that's what the majority of countries follow. Cyclical economic change, on the other hand, was our process of going through booms, recessions, and depressions. So we talked through those, had a recap on those bits that we've done earlier in the course. Then we started looking at a bit of an introduction to Birmingham, and we started thinking about the north-south divide. We started thinking about whether there even was a north-south divide. So I asked you to put these cities or classify them into a binary of north and south, and then draw on what effectively you'd made as the north-south divide. With that, we looked at a bit of text about Birmingham, which effectively ended up saying that everything in that introduction is true. Here's a map of Birmingham. So Birmingham's our second largest city in the UK, and we talked about the notion of, on a settlement hierarchy, Birmingham being a conurbation, a city that's spread out so much, there's been so much urban sprawl that it's gone into other settlements. So from this map, you can see how there's a kind of continuous urban fabric all the way through from Birmingham up into Wolverhampton, connecting places like Walsall and Solihull as well. So for it to be a conurbation on the settlement hierarchy, it has to be a decent sized city to start spreading. You can't just have a village that absorbs a small isolated hamlet and call that a conurbation. Your original settlement needs to be quite large. Then we used the link that was on here to find out how Birmingham had benefited from the EU. There are a series of different flagship projects around the city that have benefited from the UK's previous EU membership. Idea was to go onto this link and have a look at them all and find out what had happened. Only a couple of sentences. What was it? What had? How much money was it? What kind of a benefit was it, etc. And then to think overall about whether the EU had been a big player in Birmingham's development or not. Let's move this PowerPoint down. EU, lovely. Right, next bit is some scanned pages from the textbook, and that gives you a whole load of information about Birmingham. Idea was to take that away, have a read through this, answer the questions that are on here. Relatively straightforward to follow from the questions that are in here. This bit down here is identifying 3 key players that influence recent change in Birmingham, describing the changes and how they've helped bring that about. This grid in here should have summarised really the history of Birmingham and what's gone on. So I looked at a series of different changes during that structural economic change and divvied it up into different sections. That's a kind of summary of some of the material you should have covered. And this bit on here, this bit on here should give you the key vocab for this part of the course. So conurbation, that large city that encapsulated smaller settlements as it grew outwards, industrial revolution, the period of time in which heavy industry became common, we started burning fossil fuels, urban sprawl, the physical growth of a city going outwards into the rural countryside, so eating up greenbelt and not brownfield land, local authority housing estate. So a local authority owned housing estate is obviously for low income earners. Global recession, we've talked about. OPEC is the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's a group of countries that include places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Venezuela, etc., that pull together to get better deals and stabilise oil prices. Outsourcing, the process by which a multinational might decide to move some of its processes abroad in order to search some kind of comparative advantage to improve its profits. Youthful population, that notion of a bottom-heavy population on a population pyramid, so lots of kids under the age of 16 or so. Regeneration, that process by which lots of money is pumped into an area to help try and kickstart the economy in that given space. And the four that are at the bottom are all bits of large infrastructure that you should have covered already, linked into Birmingham. You should have written a 16 marker, and that 16 marker should have come through to Mrs. Thorne or I. This grid down here should have given you pretty much a plan for it. There's a mark scheme on here, and that notion of trying to turn your paragraphs into peel paragraphs. There is a page on here that explains what each of those are. Then we went on to start looking at placemaking. Lots of you, if you are like previous cohorts, will do something on place in your independent investigation. So some important content here to gobble up in terms of thinking about sort of doubling up use not only on the course but also on your independent investigation. So the first part of this was trying to come up with a definition of what placemaking was. All these bits at the top were things that I'd taken from different websites that basically gave their own visions of what placemaking was. So come up with a kind of summary definition of what was on there. Chicago are the experts on placemaking. They were the first ones to come out with lots of info, and other cities have followed their lead. So the Chicago placemaking guide is on a link down here on the bottom, and isn't worth reading if you're just doing this for A level, but if you're doing it for an independent investigation, it will be one of the key bits of reading to get you started on thinking about place. And their principles are in here. And the idea was that the bits that were on the slides, these bits on here, were the bits that should go in the gap. So you should be able to work out which of those fill into those 11 gaps that are over on the side over there. We then went on to look at another bit of theory which suggested the notion of the power of 10 plus, so that a successful city needed to have 10 different major destinations across it. And the idea of what classified as a major destination was a place that had sort of 10 specific places within each. You could do 10 different things. So we had a go at deciding whether we thought Cambridge was a successful city. And Cambridge is quite small as a city in global standards and may have struggled to get our 10. But we did have a go at trying to divvy up 10 locations that we thought had sort of enough distinctive places within each of them, just about scraped through. If we were doing this in London, for example, we'd have come up with hundreds of different places that we could have classified this as, but we just about got there in Cambridge. We then looked at the place diagram down on here, and the place diagram splits up the key attributes of what makes a successful place, and it then further explains the notion of things that are intangible that you can't touch and things that you could measure. Now, the place diagram is a really good one for independent investigations because actually you could use a segment of this, perhaps a quarter of it, or all 4 of them if you decided to think about whether locations were successful places. It gives you some ideas of things that you could measure around the outside when you're out in the field, for example. And we tried to come up with some ideas of things that you could measure, and we asked you to come up with 2 ideas of things you could measure on each of these. So if you look back to the place diagram and you went into the uses bit, for example, the property values, that could be down on the same bit on here that is the uses and activities down here. And one of the things you could have done as an idea is you could have looked on Zoopla for local house purchasing or rental prices and that. Further down, we started looking at some of the kind of background to Birmingham and why Birmingham needed redeveloping. So we looked at some old black and whites of Birmingham in the 1980s, just to try and give you the scene of how grubby and grotty the city centre used to be. A lively sense of community, but in terms of its built environment, pretty run down and pretty dilapidated in parts, which is why it's had so much money spent moving forwards. This building here is the Central Library. In fact, it's this kind of monstrous building in the background, really, that houses the old Central Library and has subsequently been knocked down. I lived in Birmingham when this building was here, and it was universally panned. It was horrible. There's a walkthrough that you go into here to go to the nice square behind that's got the new library in, and it was a pretty horrible part of the town. We then did some work where you had a look at conducting a mini bit of research, and you should have asked some questions to a parent or a grandparent or someone who'd been to Birmingham before and done a transcription. You should have had a go at writing up that transcription. That's a process that you might have to do in your independent investigation, depending on what you're doing. We then looked at foreign direct investment. Those letters should have gone in those gaps. The answers are over on the side. Some information about how much FDI was in Birmingham. Birmingham basically gets its inward investment from an organisation called Business Birmingham. So if you have a look at their website that's on there, have a scroll through their website and just have a look at what they do and how much money they grab in. These are some of the reasons. These ones are a little bit outdated, and actually if you go on the Business Birmingham website, you can get slightly, you can get more up-to-date figures on, if you just scroll down here, this thing that scrolls through is all the same bits that are on that handout, but just with the data from the last couple of years. So you'll see some of them even have the same picture, some of them have the same data, but they're probably slightly better to use for you. These questions are relatively straightforward. You'll be able to follow those on there. We then looked at the big city plan. So there's a couple of links on here that will give you some clips about the big city plan. You can either, as you're playing the PowerPoint, just click play, or the links are found in the notes underneath the PowerPoint. Some basic overview statistics, things that you want to learn for your quizzes next summer down in there. And once you've looked at the overview documents of Birmingham, then it's really getting into a bit of the nitty gritty. So to do this, we wanted you to have a look at some of the big bits of infrastructure that are being built around the city. So there's a document that should be in your SharePoint called The Changing Face of Birmingham. This is also, as well as it being on Schoology, it's also on the OneNote, and it looks like this. This is actually a 2019 version of this document, Addison Young's Evolving Cities, The Changing Face of Birmingham. And in the PDF, the first bit of it talks about what has happened already, so the recent changes that are on here. There's a page that links into each of the projects. So Brindley Place, that's in fact the square where I watched Andy Murray win Wimbledon, is a bit of infrastructure in the middle of the city centre. It's got a page for each of them. Then if you scroll further down, it's got a section in here that looks forwards into the future, to the things that are soon to be arriving. So Birmingham Curzon, for example, which will be the HS2 terminal in the city centre, which will add to the big three railway stations that are already serving Birmingham. Now, if you have a look at this, let's just open these two back up. I want that one and I want that one. Let's close that down. If you look at this bit here, it says 5 completed projects, of which you need to do those 3, and then 3 projects that are coming up, of which you need to do this one. That's because these are really important ones, the 4 that we've got in here, but we want you to have a free range to look at a few others as well. That 2019 version of the report doesn't have, which one was it? One of these isn't in here. I can't remember which one it was, but if you open up and you go, if you use the same name, the file's called The Changing Face of Birmingham. If you type into Google, The Changing Face of Birmingham PDF 2017, the second link down here, it's a 2017 version. We'll open up a slightly older version of the PDF. You'll see there's a different, the date on here is a 2017 date. It's a slightly older one and it's got slightly different projects. So some of the older ones in here you'll be able to get access to, and actually some of the ones that are going forwards, the future ones at the bottom, don't use those on the old document, because on the old document the stats are a little bit outdated. But for the ones that have already been built, some of them are no longer quite so new and shiny, so they're not included on the new one. Sorry, that's a bit complicated. Right, back here. With those eight bits of the big city plan, then those are to be put onto a sketch map in here of central Birmingham. That sketch map should roughly be the same scale as the map that's on here. So there's the ring road, the yellow bit that goes around the outside of Birmingham, and there's a list down here of what to include in your sketch map. So the major parts of the big city plan are your 8 bits that are on here, and you can have your 5 bits that are already done, your 3 bits moving forwards. That's some more reading. Next bit looks at soft rebranding, this notion that rebranding doesn't have to be about building things, it can just be about how you package them. So Birmingham and Solihull's local enterprise partnership have put forward this idea of calling or putting the word greater at the start of things. So they talk about Greater Birmingham this, Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, Greater Birmingham Professional Services Academy. The idea that just the word greater, if you keep mentioning it, gives people more of a positive view on things. So there's a question down here about what does soft rebranding really mean, and what Birmingham done, and you could even write something about whether you think it's successful or not. The next bit of rebranding is to do with sport in Birmingham, and fundamentally sport in Birmingham isn't particularly massive. The football's big. They've got Villa and Blues, Birmingham City, who have sort of dropped in and out of the Premiership over the last decade. And when the two are in the same league, there's a big ding-dong in the city centre, and it gets pretty lively. But apart from that, there's not a lot going on. Edgbaston is one of England's Test cricket grounds, so that's probably the other big bit of sporting infrastructure in and around the city. But for a city that's the second most important in the country, they're absolutely miles behind what London offers. But that is set to change. They are now hosting the 2022 Commonwealth Games. So these bits in here should answer some questions, or you should be able to find out some answers about those. And there's some links down on the pack in here about Birmingham 2022 and how that rebranding of the city as this kind of centre of sport in the country should really help the city's development. Then we did a clone town survey, so the idea of a clone town being one that's indistinguishable from others. So we talked about different locations around the city, and we tried to do a clone town survey remotely on all those different locations. You then used an Excel file with longitudes and latitudes for all of the locations that you'd found and the clone town survey data that you'd collected. You saved that document, converted it to a CSV file, and dumped it onto ArcGIS to make proportional circle maps, and tested that we remembered how to do that, an important skill for your project. You should be able to read this home clown survey to find out exactly what happens on it. It's supposed to be designed for anyone to pick up and run. Right, that is about where both groups got to. And moving forwards in time, what would I like you to do with info going forwards? Let me just write down 21 minutes so I can get people to go to that when I launch this. Right. So what I'd like you to do going forwards is I would like you to have a look at how Birmingham has used its architecture to rebrand and how it's used construction of new locations like the Central Library to change its cityscape. So in here, have a look at and research the new the old Central Library. That's the grubby old building I showed you on the black and white earlier in the clip, and find out what it was like. Then, more importantly, we need to have a look at the new Birmingham Library. And the new Birmingham Library is absolutely superb. It's one of my favourite buildings in the city centre. It is a stunning piece of architecture, really. And whenever I had friends to visit in Birmingham, it was always the place people wanted to go. There are gardens up on the roofs. There are music halls underneath, soft toy play areas. It's super funky. The little gold bit that's at the top of the building, you can see it here on the left, houses a really old room from not the old library that they knocked down, which is just off picture here, but the library before that, and they've moved it painstakingly, like piece by piece, and put it back up at the top. It's pretty special. So have a look at the new library, have a rummage around, look at their website, look at the photos, just Google Library of Birmingham. It's cool. Have a think about the transport infrastructure across the city. Airports, motorways, little sketch map here of which motorways connect up. These are the major cities around, so Coventry and Walsall, large towns run the cities, Birmingham in the middle, and the big motorways that go past that are always full of traffic. Find the 3 main railway stations that are around the city at the moment and find out where they connect up to, which is your London one, for example. And then the same job as you did with the library, but with the Birmingham New Street station. So find some old images, have a look at the new ones. This is an image of what the one on the new station looks like. It's fantastic. For most of you who won't have been to the old station, you don't realise how grubby and horrible it was. Your first view of Birmingham as you came into this city was ghastly. The change in terms of people's perceptions of locations, and you only do get that one chance to make a first impression, is unreal. So the new station is superb. So moving on from that, I want you to have a go at. Well, actually, we want you to do this in slightly different order, and we'd like you to have a go at this 16 marker after you've done the 6 marker that follows up. But I'll talk you through the 16 marker now because it's in this order on the pack. So this one here, the placemaking process of rebranding constructs a different meaning through re-imaging and regeneration, compare and contrast the extent to which 2 projects in a city influence the placemaking process of rebranding. So use the library and the station. Think about what the question's asking. So rebranding, you're a brand of something. If you think about Apple as a brand, and if they went through a rebranding process, they'd be trying to give themselves a different look. That's exactly what Birmingham's doing. it's trying to package itself slightly differently so people don't think of it as an old manufacturing industrial dump, but think about it as this 21st century city that's buzzing and academic and full of business and opportunity and all kinds of things. So it says later in the title, through re-imaging and regeneration. So re-imaging, what's an image? It's a visual thing. So re-imaging is changing the visual aspect of something. So it's changing the cityscapes, changing the building materials, changing what a place looks like. And regeneration is all about rejuvenation. It's about pumping money into somewhere to try and give it a different lease of life. So have a think about that with those two projects, and have a go at that 16 marker. Lots of evaluation in there to compare and contrast why you think the two different projects are better or worse than one another. Have a think about longevity, how many people use them, are they for locals, are they for tourists, are they for people outside of the city, are they only for tertiary sectors, are they for everyone, are they for you, just for your workers, are they for rich, are they for poor, all those different things about who are these projects changing the perception of Birmingham for. Right. Next bit down on here, a little bit more about the EU and the placemaking process, this idea of actually going out and actively trying to create this image of a city. So started off by recapping all the different players that we've seen so far on the in the placemaking process. So have a think about who you've read about thus far. There's some information here about the EU and what the EU have done. And an article in here that gives an analysis of what the impact of Brexit might be. So there's some questions on here, and I would like you to have a go at both the 3 marker that's up here, study figure 1, which shows a part of a city in the UK in 2014. This is actually Birmingham city centre, even though the question up here doesn't say so. Explain how one piece of evidence from figure 1 shows that this place has been rebranded to construct a new image of place. There's a mark scheme on there. I'm going to get you to have a go at that question on one of the OneNote pages, and we'll be able to mark those on the OneNote page. And then there's a 6 marker underneath it. Explain how a player you have studied can influence the placemaking process. And in this one, I want you to use the EU and talk about Birmingham and answer that as a 6 marker. Again, set up a OneNote page for you to have an answer of that, and we'll give you the feedback to this 3 and 6 marker before we set a deadline for the 16 marker afterwards. So Mrs. Thorne will give you the deadlines for the other class, and I'll put mine up on my OneNote when it goes through. Then there's part of the spec that talks you through a whole series of different players that you need to have a think about in a particular location, enterprise organisations, not-for-profits, all kinds of things that pop up in here. So this really is an opportunity to have a look at a series of different organisations. There are some links on the document, or in the PowerPoint there are some videos. So in here, when it goes to the not-for-profits, for example, there's an organisation called City of Colours who do a graffiti festival. Their link is down there. Have a look at what they do and how they are influential in the placemaking process. What kind of a vibe are they giving to the city? Similar for this organisation called CIFA Fireside, who cater to a completely different organisation who basically improve health and inclusion for homeless people. And then see whether you can find a third not-for-profit somewhere in Birmingham and see what they do. Community groups down the bottom. Next bits on here, there's an organisation called the Friends of Moseley Road Baths, who try and really sort of link into old heritage and keep this building alive. There's a video on them and what they do. Really nice video actually about sort of kind of sense of community, about the soul of a location. Bits on here are linked in on the next ones. Oh no, that's on the one below, sorry. Have a Google of both of these two, the Friends of Birmingham Archives and Heritage and the Birmingham Community Gospel Choir, and have a look at what they do for the community. You only need sort of 3 bullet points in each of these. That's roughly same with these, 3 bullet points telling me what they do, who they're for, etc., etc. Charity work and how charities shape the city. So there's one here on the canals. Birmingham is the Venice of Britain. It has more canal it has a longer network of canals than Venice does. So they might not be quite as glamorous, but they are special to the city, and the city really feels like it is based still on the canal network. So when I lived in the city centre, for example, I would spend most of my recreational time either down by the canals in pubs and restaurants and things, or actually lots of the footpaths and towpaths that go up and down have been immaculately restored. So my running would be up and down routes on the kind of arteries out of the city, or I'd take a mountain bike and go on the trails that went further out because the quality of them deteriorates the further you go out the city. So they are a real lifeblood to the city even nowadays. Um, keep going. This bit on here about heritage associations. There's some organisations all on here. I've given you the information for these ones, and then just a couple of questions at the bottom, and similar about residents associations on there. So, final question on here was kind of all the players you've seen, who's had the largest impact on placemaking in Birmingham? Who's made Birmingham what it is? And you can think back to all the organisations that we've looked at, all of those players, and that's a kind of reflection over several lessons worth of content. Uh, this bit on here, oh, actually, that bit probably should be on the page before, because you do need something about social media and placemaking. So what I would do is go online somewhere, find some groups on a Facebook or equivalent, and have a look at how big they are, what they do, um, and just ensure when you look at the groups that you're looking at Birmingham in the UK and not Birmingham, Alabama, which often has larger numbers of people on those. So it's all about this notion of digital placemaking that increasingly we're making a sense of place online rather than in in the flesh. Probably something that's apt while we're chatting online and remote learning. But have a look at some of the associations and groups that have online presences and what they're doing. Lastly, the sort of evaluative bit of the whole lot is to what extent has the rebranding in Birmingham been a success? So pop down here whether you think it has, and then we'll look at some success criteria. So ultimately, has it been a success? Well, we could think about different things. What's happened to its population? To what extent is it a 24-hour city that can be used all the time? Has it promoted mixed community use? Does everyone benefit from the rebranding? And has there been a contest over the rebranding? Have some people been annoyed by what's done, or is everyone happy? So having a think about each of these, population-wise, has it been a success? Well, here we go, back in time, Industrial Revolution, kickoff, population boom, and then it's almost like a population S-curve. It stops again at the top. And when we hit industrial decline, outsourcing, etc., the population for the city starts to decrease. And the recent rebranding, we can see a little kick up here. Now that data is back to 2011. The next census and maybe the last census will be next calendar year, and that should show another increase, predicting an increase of about 5,000 people a year in Birmingham until 2030. There's been lots of work, lots of new houses being built, and lots of people moving back into the city centre. So yes, a success in terms of the numbers of population. The population is incredibly diverse. It's youthful. It's growing. You can see from these maps on here, the different parts of the city are occupied by different ethnicities. But it really is a kind of melting pot of cultures in terms of UK demographics. So yeah, it's young, it's vibrant. I'd say it was a success. Is it a 24-hour city? Questionable. If we think about London and what London's done to become a 24-hour city, there's loads of stuff. Transport runs through the night. You can do things at any point in the night. There's always stuff that's open, supermarkets, casinos, nightclubs, whatever it is that you want to go and waste your money on. But has Birmingham done quite the same? So we'll have a look at the evidence for whether we think it has. Be up on here. It's got some late night venues, a few places, some 24-hour casinos. some coffee shops, a gym that's a 24-hour gym, some bus services. But lots of the things finish just after midnight. Is it a 24-hour city? Arguably just about, but nowhere near as much as London, for example. There's a really nice graphic on here that sort of shows the UK's cities by whether they have large numbers of things that can open through the night, and kind of ranks them accordingly. So London at the top as the biggest has um, loads of things that are open. 35 casinos across the city, for example. Birmingham has 3 that are open through the night. It does well on other factors, things like supermarkets, etc. But it's restaurants and things. There's different factors on here. So if you click on the button at the bottom, it'll take you through to a website that analyzes whether locations are 24-hour cities. Have a look at how Birmingham fares on that. Does it promote mixed community use? Yeah, it can do. There's a really multicultural vibe to the city. There are lots of different sections of the city that are sort of dominated by different ethnicities. So Chinatown has a really Asian feel to it. There's a Balti Triangle that's famous for its curries. There's a gay quarter that's really vibrant near to the theatres and things like that. So yeah, I think in terms of mixed community usage, there is in terms of mixed community use, there is lots of opportunities for things to happen. Um, have any of the groups been marginalised at the expense of others? There's not been too much of a clash in honesty across the city. So the content, uh, content-wise, has there been a contest over rebranding? Yeah, there has. Um, Employment rates are still fairly poor. The argument is that the rebranding really favours kind of tertiary industries and the wealthy. It's all based around kind of academia, whereas what happened in Birmingham was that its industrial powerhouse disappeared. And can you reskill all those people? Probably not in lots of cases. Some of them will be able to find new jobs in new locations, but um, are we sorting the city out and inviting new populations in, or are those that have been Brummies for their whole lives still going to benefit from what's going on? So the last bits in the pack is some extra reading. If you want to have a look at it, there's no need to. But if you are thinking about Birmingham as a location for your independent investigation, or you're thinking about something on placemaking, you might want to dip into those. I hope that's gives you an overview of what you've done and what you need to do going forwards. If you've got any questions, just ask us.